Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Yellow Tape. My name is Julian. Unfortunately, you see my co-host Nitty is not here today. She's feeling under the weather. So everybody, keep your thoughts on Nitty that she'll get better, which she will, of course. You know, she's strong. Guys, today we had a great episode. I won't lie to you. Today we had a John Paul Osborn on, who's like a rock star in the forensic question document examination community. He's been of service for 40 years and has done over 3,000 cases. He's been in the field since 1982, and this guy knows everything, and he's amazing. Uh, he's been doing cases that involve handwriting, signatures, everything, guys. Like, this guy is crazy. And he joined us. He was joined with his associate, Kelsey Osborn. And the crazy thing about these guys are they're the fourth and fifth generation of question document examiners from the great lineage of who some might call the godfather of forensic document examination, Albert S. Osborn, who started a lab in 1910. So they're working in the oldest private lab for question documents in America, which is amazing. And I gotta stop drooling over these guys because I learned so much. We have so much to go through. This is a great episode, guys. So before we get into it, I want you guys to like, share, and subscribe. This episode is fantastic. And we're just gonna get into it. I'm gonna stop talking and here we go. So what is forensic document examination? How does that work? Because it's a one, I don't really think people honestly know what it is, me and Nitty included. So could you explain what it is and give us a small background as to how it works?
Sure. Forensic document examination involves the examination of physical evidence as they appear on documents. So we're talking about what people oftentimes associate with this work, which is handwriting examinations to determine the genuineness or non-genuineness of writing, or to make determinations attempting to associate a particular person with a particular body of what we refer to as questioned writing. But it also involves looking at other kinds of physical evidence. So, for instance, indentations that appear on documents. And that may be important as an example in a case involving a demand note in a robbery, a bank robbery, where a person comes in to rob a bank, hands a demand note over to a teller, and later on that note is examined, and it's found that there are indentations of writings which occurred while those writings were on top of the demand note. Let's say the demand note was produced on a pad of yellow paper or on a post-it note supplied in pads, and the writing is writing which was caused by appears on or was sourced with previous sheets in the same pad. So you might have that demand note, and then you might have a grocery list written on the sheet before, or you might have a Dear Mom note written, where you could associate that paper with a particular individual. So that can be important. We also look at things like differentiating visually writing inks. So you can have a obliterated body of writing, something that's been scratched out multiple times, and attempt to visually eliminate the obliterating ink so you can read what's underneath. So there's lots of different kinds of evidence that we examine that go beyond just merely looking at handwriting and making determinations with respect to writing.
Right. Another good example would be document alterations. So documents as far as machine printed text, whether that's been altered in any way, or if pages have been substituted, like in a lease or maybe a will. We can look at things like that. That's really one of the reasons I love this field so much, is it's got such a wide range of cases that you can get. And that's just really talking about the type of cases that we can get. the IRS and the FBI labs can look at things like counterfeit IDs or other counterfeit like security documents. So it gets to be really interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that both Kelsey and I would certainly agree with is that the variety of casework keeps the work very interesting. I mean, I've been doing this for
Right.
40 years, and the variety of casework that I've experienced is just amazing.
And I've only been doing this a year past my training, and I've already had a plethora of very interesting cases. So I hope that I can only get half as many interesting cases as he does as I continue to do this.
Right, right. That's crazy. This has to be probably one of the most niche fields in forensics because I myself know nothing about it. I'm sure most of our viewers have heard about it, but never, seen it in action other than something in the movies like Catch Me If You Can or something like that. So that's definitely super interesting.
Yeah, it is, because although it's really niche, it's actually one of the oldest forensics and it's been around for a really long time. I mean, there has been handwriting analysis in the courts as far back as the Romans. So this
mm.
has been around, but as a forensics field, it's still one of the oldest in the United States.
So how does one go about examining signatures and handwriting off of documents? Like, what are the kinds of instruments you would use to help you out with that?
Well, I mean, the most
That a broad
the
question?
most usable instrument are the things that sit on my face.
Ah,
No,
gotcha.
it's having the ability to make form differentiations. It's having the knowledge to know what it is to look for. But really, as far as handwriting and signatures are concerned, it's something that the average person can readily understand. As a matter of fact, of the forensic sciences and in instances of expert testimony, it's one of the things that actually puts more pressure on us because your average fact finder, your average lay juror or judicial officer obviously has to be literate. So they have a basic understanding already of the action of writing. And
Right.
what you're doing is just basically guiding them through the process of what we do. I mean, as an example, um, no one is physically capable of signing their name exactly the same way twice. Every single signature you've ever written, I've ever written, or anybody else for that matter, is unique unto itself. There,
Makes
there
sense.
are very, very consistent writers, and there are some writers that are not nearly as consistent. But the point is that every single signature is unique unto itself. So it's important to have that knowledge and to understand that. And most people do. Most people, when they are listening to, testimony as an example, and I say, well, no one can write their name exactly the same way twice, you
Mm.
usually get a bunch of heads nodding up and down because people recognize that about their own writing, and that gee, I never sign my name exactly the same way twice. It's always a little bit different. Well, that's
Right.
part of natural variation. One of the things that one of the tenets that are part of this work is that no two people have identical writing features. That there will always be things about your writing that are different from other people's writing. And you may have a number of similarities with another person. For instance, if you have two people that grew up in the same town and went to the same school system and learned how to write utilizing the same a writing system, then you're
Mm.
bound to get similarities.
Right.
But over the course of time, you develop your own personal habits, your own personal characteristics that not one of them could be reasonably described as unique, but the combination of all of those different features are things that represent a unique pattern of writing and unique to the one individual writer. So when we're
Mm.
performing examinations, we obviously need to be aware of those things. And then what we're doing is a basic comparative analysis where we're looking at questioned writing, let's say a signature, and determining what characteristics exist within that questioned signature, that disputed signature,
Right.
looking at those characteristics, and then using a large group of specimen signatures, determining whether or not the question signatures, the disputed signature, falls inside or outside of the range of variation established by the known specimens. And that's why we need so many, is we have to be able to look at natural variation. And so we require, specimens that are relatively contemporaneous with the time a question signature was written. We're looking for examples that on a variety of different kinds of documents, including documents similar to the one that a disputed signature appears on. And all of these things come into play in terms of making an appropriate or having an appropriate bank of known specimens, and then making that comparative analysis to determine whether or not the question signature conforms to that range of variation, or in several respects falls outside of that range of variation, and making a determination based on that data.
So to just kind of go off of what he was saying, our basic process when we're doing, say, a signature examination, we would have our question signature or signatures, and then we would have our client or their attorney supply about 20 to 25 known genuine signatures of the person that the question signature is purported to be from. So say the question signature is from John Smith, then we want 20 to 25 known samples of John Smith's signature. And that 20 to 25 isn't a magic number. Like John said, with natural range of variation, sometimes people are very consistent and have a small range of variation. So maybe we get 15 to 17, and that's more than enough for us to come up with a strong conclusion. Right. Or if they have a really wide range of variation, people may give us 30 examples of the signature, and we have to ask for more. And it's to do exactly what he said, to determine if any similarities or differences that we find fall within that natural range of variation or not.
And the idea is that you're attempting to make an association or disassociate the writing. So making or observing significant differences in form, observing whether or not a body of writing contains evidence that indicates that was an attempt to simulate, are all part of the process. And the process is standardized. There's published standards that exist. They're available online. Anybody can read them. And both Kelsey and I are involved with standard development through a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce called the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right.
And standards are reviewed and updated as needed. And we have several standards online and published, and that anybody can look at.
And if anybody, viewers or anybody is interested in looking at those, they are free to view to the public, and they are on a website called swgdoc, swgdoc.org. And that's got all of our current published standards. So it's a good source of information if people are interested in what we do and how we do it.
All right, guys, go check it out. But with that, I do have even more questions now. So I guess wider variety of signatures would entail a larger number of samples. So how do you guys report your findings? Because it sounds like I'm taking a shot in the dark here, but you know how like DNA, they have probability when they report their findings? Is it that as well? Like this? No, not at all.
No.
Let's hear it.
So because we're a more subjective field, our conclusions aren't quantifiable like it would be with DNA. So currently, our current standard is a 9-point scale. So just imagine a horizontal line, and in the middle we have conclusion or inconclusive or no conclusion, and then going out from that in both directions we have indications, probable, highly probable, and then the penultimates of identification or elimination. And that's for genuine or non-genuine.
Conclusions in our field are expressed in words rather than numbers because
Right.
of the variability and abstract nature of writing. And
Right.
so, there's some conclusions that we reach which don't involve writing, like, for instance, determining the presence of indentations or determining that two writing inks are different from one another, that can automatically be expressed in either a yes or a no, either they are or they aren't. But with writing, because of its abstract nature and making determinations of something that is so variable, the expression of conclusions is given in words, and those standards, the standard for conclusion terminology, is also available on the same website. I will say this, that right now, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is doing reviews of all standards in all forensic sciences. And one of the standards we're currently battling over is the conclusion terminology standard, and whether we should employ standards more similar to the European style of reporting conclusions. But right now, the SWGDOC standard, the older standard, is still what we use, which is the 9-point scale that Kelsey just described.
Okay. So quickly, can you quickly explain what's the European standards?
Well, the European standard in many instances involves basically an acknowledgement that there are two competing propositions. Okay, so proposition one is that the signature is a genuine signature, and proposition two is that the signature is not a genuine signature. And you, over the course of examinations, build towards evidence which supports or very strongly supports one proposition over the other. But the way the reporting is done and the way the conclusions are explained is one which never ignores the competing proposition. So there's always that opposite proposition, even in instances where the support for that proposition is very, very weak. It's a little bit more confusing than a straightforward, identification of a signature.
Right.
But from the legal perspective, it's attractive because it establishes that the expert is always acknowledging that there's another possibility, even if the possibility is so remote that there's almost no evidence to support it.
Right. So it falls under the saying that, nothing is impossible, but it's just not probable.
Right. And then, so your findings with that 9-point scale fall into that. I'm assuming it's maybe like I don't want to call it a bell curve, but it's falling into one of these.
So it's kind of interesting. So really, probable, highly probable, and the penultimates are all very close together, whereas indications, those three, probable, highly probable, and the penultimates, are very strong conclusions.
Right.
The indications represents basically a gray area where you're reporting, like, for instance, if I was doing work for an investigator and I reported that there are indications the investigator's target was the writer, what I would be saying is that there is evidence to suggest that that person is the writer, but insufficient evidence to really formulate what you would associate with a strong conclusion. And what I'm saying is, hey, look, I think you're going after the right target, but we have a lot more evidence to build to confirm or refute that rather weak conclusion. And what's interesting about the conclusion scale that people don't recognize, because they're used to watching, television shows about forensic science, and, the forensic scientists magically always come up with a very strong determination, is the definitive nature of the inconclusive. In our terminology, it's a no conclusion. And an inconclusive is a definitive determination. a definitive determination that no determination can be made based on available evidence. And it's very important to understand that, because you may have instances where, let's say, you know, a rather unqualified examiner makes a determination, and that determination is inappropriate because the evidence doesn't support it, even though the opposite determination is equally unsupported. And sometimes an inconclusive, sometimes a no conclusion is the correct conclusion, and it's definitive.
Gotcha. Okay, so like that, I guess a lot of people don't know that that gray area is an actual option in forensics. I feel like a lot of people think that it's a match or like a or not. Like
Right. And that
many
a
people
lot
don't
of that,
understand
Yeah,
that.
it's not black or white. It's
Right.
it's
Right.
there are gray area, and the big gray area in our conclusion scale is indications. When you get into probable, highly probable, and the strongest conclusions of identification or elimination, you know, the difference is really a matter of what we term as a limiting factor. So let's say I get a signature and I'm examining that signature, and I have all the material that I need in order to make a determination. I have plenty of specimens. I have some specimens that are original writing ink on paper. I have it within that particular time period. I have it on a variety of documents, all of the components that make for a great set of specimens. But the disputed signature, the signature that's in question, I don't have the original. I only have a copy. Well, that doesn't stop me from making a determination, but I do have to acknowledge that limiting factor in the way I report by stating that I only saw a copy of that signature, and also tempering the conclusion terminology that I employ. So instead of saying, well, I'm going to identify that signature as being genuine, I would say it is highly probable. And the reason that I'm not providing a definitive, you know, that kind of strong conclusion is to acknowledge that limiting factor of only having a copy of the disputed signature.
right. So if you had, say, 3 or 4 limiting factors, you would then bring that down another step. So even if we feel strongly about a conclusion one way or the other, we have to acknowledge limiting factors and temper our conclusions to match those limiting factors.
Right. So pretty much the amount of evidence plays a, as it does in all cases, but the amount of like signatures to compare it to will play a large part, of course, in
Right.
Yeah,
And not
in
just the
your
quantity,
conclusions.
but the quality plays
quality.
a really big part of that too.
Mm.
Now, we like to tell people that we can examine anything you submit to us document-wise, but with the understanding that the quantity and quality can and will affect how strongly we can conclude. And the worse the quantity and quality is, the more likely it is that we're going to end up with a no conclusion or an inconclusive.
Right, right. Okay, that makes perfect sense. And you were saying about how you might have two different samples, and one might be you might have a copy of one, and the other one you might have from the original parchment. And you made something that made me think of time. You said something that made me think of time about how like one might be fresher than the other. So can you determine like time of deposition, I suppose, from the ink
So
from two samples, I guess?
yes and no. We personally can't because we aren't trained in that, but
No one can. Okay, you can make a determination with respect to a potential range of time and whether or not ink falls within that range based on chemical analysis, which is actually done by a subspecialty of ours, if you can believe that, called forensic ink chemistry. And a forensic ink chemist may be able to do chemical testing to determine relative age of ink, but within a time period. So let's say if a document was supposedly dated in 1982, a forensic ink chemist may be able to analyze the ink and determine, no, it had to have been written because of the chemical reaction and characteristics of that ink within the past 48 months. And obviously that would make that 1982 date incorrect.
Right.
Right, right.
But as far as what you were talking about, what we mentioned with time is contemporaneousness of samples. So say our question signature is from 2018, then the most preferable knowns that we get should be from 2018, 2017, or 2019, around that range. And that's because people's handwriting is dynamic. It changes over time. Or say, for a particular instance, our question signature is written by somebody who at the time was suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. In order to determine whether the things that we are seeing are differences or evidence of simulation, we need to be able to compare that writing with contemporaneous writing to see if those changes are within that natural range of variation or not.
Right.
So while we can look at stuff that's newer or older than our document and the date that it's from, we want to try and get it as close in date as possible so the handwriting falls within that range as close as possible.
An affected writing ability, an effect, no matter what the cause, an affected writing ability will generally cause a greater variation, a greater natural variation, even though it's a product of something, a circumstance that's occurring with that particular person at a particular time. To the extent that with that in that situation, you really need to kind of narrow the time period from where you're deriving or where you're collecting your specimens, because we want to focus on that particular time period, because that particular time period is the time period where the effect, would exhibit more consistent, a more consistent presence of those degraded writing features.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So earlier you were talking about the indented writing. Is that just a visual thing, or can you like use something to get, I guess maybe the imprint of the previous page out? And would that be the maybe same technique that you talked about if someone crossed or tried to obliterate something? Would that be the same technique?
So you have the spiral notebook, you get the impressions of what you wrote on the page above. So when they're very clear like that, we can really use we can either just visually see it with our eyes, or we can use side lighting to see it more clearly, and we'll just take photographs of it. But sometimes those indentations, if they're pages down or lighter, are invisible to their eyes. So they're latent indentations, like latent fingerprints. And that's when we use our ESDA, which is the electrostatic detection apparatus. And the way that works is we will take the page that we want to test for indentations, humidify the document, and then we will put it on the top of the ESDA, and that has a vacuum plate, and it'll suck the page down. And then we'll take film and cover the document to protect it. And that's important because ESDA is non-destructive testing, which means it won't permanently alter the document or our evidence in any way. So we'll put the film over there, and then we use the Corona, which is what he's pointing out right now. And this is a wand that electrostatically charges the film and the document. So then we'll hold it up at an angle, and we have these little tiny beads that are impregnated with toner. And that's our cascade developer. So we'll shake that. He's got that right here, and he'll open that so you can see kind of what that looks like.
Ooh, one of our first, examples. This is great. So I'm ready when you are.
You can see those are all super, super tiny. So what that does is we shake it over the document after it's been electrostatically charged, and that toner will sink into the indentations if they're there, and make it to where we can clearly see the indentations if they're present. So then we'll just take a piece of fixing film and put that on top of the film with the cascade developer. And then
that laminates it.
Yes, and that basically laminates it. So what we can do is take the film with the fixing film on it off, take our document down. It's nice and safe, hasn't been changed in any way. But then we can take our film that's captured those indentations and use it either as like a clear sheet that we can put on a lighting to see if it matches up with any sources, or we can just use it to have a nice clear picture of what our indentations are. I think I have one up there if you want to grab it. This is kind of what the results look like. So you can
okay.
just barely see
With the
this one's
fingerprints.
not
Yeah, I
super
can see
clear.
that perfectly.
You can see the fingerprints, but there's also handwriting there. It's super light there. You can kind of see it says
Oh, so Kelsey on it.
yeah,
Gotcha,
so
gotcha.
that's an example of like what indentations that were picked up would look like. But what's interesting about the ESDA is you saw the fingerprints on there. When the
Right.
ESDA was created by the company Foster and Freeman, it was originally created to pick up latent fingerprints, but they discovered that it was also fantastic at picking up latent indentation. So they ended up developing it further to be used by document examiners.
Got you. So when you made that paper right there, you pretty much had another sheet of paper on it or several sheets of paper on it, wrote on it, and then
Yes,
use the
what we'll do when we're, say, doing like a calibration test to make sure that our ISDA is doing what we're supposed to, I'll take like a page that has a blank page and then another blank page behind it, and I'll write on the top page, and then we'll test the page beneath it that doesn't have any handwriting on it. And we'll do things like calibration test, the alphabet, the numbers 0 through 9, and the signature in different sections of the document to make sure that the ESDA is picking up everything that we are expecting it to pick up.
One of the things, though, that is kind of interesting that you might not expect is that when we get negative results, in other words, when we conduct an ESDA test on a document to determine whether there are any indentations and we find none, that test result is still preserved, because not only does it establish that we actually did the test, but also that the result was basically a negative result, that there was nothing present of relevance to look at on that particular sheet, and that maintains the credibility of the overall series of tests if we're doing multiple pages. That each page was actually tested.
Right, and what you'll find is if there's like a stack of pages, a lot of times with the writing on top, you'll get a very clear impression on the first 2-ish pages, and then the deeper you go, those indentations are going to be lighter and lighter. So if we have very light indentations on a page that we tested, we could determine that maybe the source page was 5 or 6 pages above it if the indentations were super light. So it's a really interesting test to see, and it's one that I love performing.
What can be really difficult, though, is when you do have, like, let's say you have a pad of paper, and so you're getting indentations on one of the sheets of multiple pages, and they intersect with one another. So sometimes it can be very difficult to differentiate.
Oh, like handwriting over handwriting?
Right, exactly.
Gotcha.
So sometimes that can be a real interference in trying to determine the specific writing for the source page that you're looking for.
How would you sort that out? I guess, would you keep going down until one fades away and then you still had like one left?
mean, basically, to some degree, you can gauge the impressions based on their consistency in density. So, the darker impressions will typically be exhibited in an ESDA test as darker than impressions from sheets further up, because obviously you have the less pressure because you have more sheets cushioning that writing instrument as you're going up through the pad.
But as far as what you were talking about with the obliterations, we use a different machine called the Video Spectral Comparator, or VSC. And what's important about that, there's 2 things. Is the first, this is also a non-destructive test. So what's important to know about the VSC is first that it's non-destructive. It won't do anything to permanently alter the evidence. And the second is that the VSC can only be used to look for paper and ink differences. So ink will react one of three ways under the different light sources that we have with the VSC.
Okay.
It will reflect, which means it looks basically just like ink on paper.
Right.
It will luminesce, so basically it'll start to glow. Or it will become transparent. So if you turn up the power on the VSC, it'll look like the ink is disappearing from the page. But if two inks react the same under the light sources, that does not mean that those are the same inks. In order to find out sameness of ink, you have to get into the ink chemistry. So we can only look for differences.
This is a VSC. It's a
Gotcha.
video spectral comparator. And I'm not going to go through, a comprehensive description, but basically one of the things that this device helps us to do is to differentiate writing inks. And that can be effective if you're trying to determine if two inks that looks the same to the naked eye are in fact different.
Right.
Like, for instance, if you have a body of writing where you suspect something was added, the writing ink looks the same, but you want to examine it to determine that that is the case, you may be able to differentiate the writing inks, or in instances like the example that I'm going to show you, where you have obliterated writing. So in this particular instance, we have an example showing the two different writing instruments that we used, Pilot Varsity and a big soft field black ballpoint pen, and an obliterated section of writing to the left. And the black ballpoint pen was used to create the obliterations. So under normal lighting, it's going to be virtually impossible to see what exists or what was written underneath with the second writing instrument. But if we add a little bit of ultraviolet lighting, we'll be able to make a determination very easily as to what's underneath.
Oh my.
And
oh wow. So it's completely pretty much erasing that felt soft point one, right?
Right. So what's happening here is the Pilot Varsity pen is luminescing, like it's shining like a neon light. And the Bic pen, the black ballpoint pen, under these lighting conditions becomes transparent. In other words, it on the screen, it disappears from view. It's probably not possible to see over this, with this camera, but very, very faintly, you can actually see the Bic pen, or at least the indentations of the Bic pen.
I'm barely can, which is perfect for this example.
It's just a characteristic of physics that that allows us to do that. Nothing confusing, nothing unusual, but it can provide really important evidence in certain instances, particularly in instances involving altered documents.
Okay, that's cool as hell. I won't lie to you. So, so you said that the VSC did three things, and could you go over them three things again, and then just
well, it does a lot more than
what we just see.
As far as the inks.
Oh,
yeah, sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
So inks typically will react in one of three ways. They will remain reflective, meaning basically they stay the same. They stay
like nothing would have happened when you put the UV on them.
They may become transparent, meaning visually the ink disappears from view.
And it should be noted that it's not actually disappearing off the page. It just looks like that with the light sources in the VSC.
Right. Of the reflection and the type of light that's alternate lighting sources being used. And the third is luminesce. So in this particular instance, the Pilot pen luminesce, it shined like a neon light. And when you have those two extremes, oftentimes it's very easy to see, for instance, even under a significant obliteration, what's written underneath. Now, the question that's often asked is, well, what if you have the writing and then it's obliterated with the same ink? Well, then you can't do anything.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're, SOL. Gotcha. That was crazy. That was very cool. So the soft field one was that the one that was transparent while
No,
the one on
yeah,
top
no, right. The black ballpoint soft field Bic pen was the one
became
that became transparent, disappeared
right.
from view, and the
The other
pilot
one
pen,
luminesced.
luminesced,
Right.
and you know that those are just examples of two writing inks.
Right.
What's
That was
interesting though
crazy.
is sometimes inks can exhibit multiple reactions. So maybe under one strength of
Mm,
the VSC, it'll be reflective, and then if you increase it, it can become transparent or
Luminescent.
luminesce. So just
okay.
because it's reacting one way under a certain strength or a certain filter doesn't mean that's the only way it's going to react. So it's important
Okay.
as we're going through and testing it that we're taking pictures on the VSC of every reaction that we get. So say we're trying to see if two inks react the same on the document. We can go through all the different levels, and while they may react the same for parts of it, they may react differently under the different powers and filters of the
And then
VSC.
there's nothing
Mm,
magic about it. It's basic, straightforward physics and the reaction of light to substrates. And the thing about the VSC is it's a self-contained unit that gives us all of these lights and all of these different filters in one unit to allow us to go through this progression of examinations and to determine whether or not inks can be differentiated. And it works quite similar with paper. So, like
right.
in an instance where you suspect that a contract, a 10-page contract, page 5 was inserted, the pages have no watermarks, so no identifying manufacturer features, but each of 9 of those pages reacts by a very, very strong luminescence.
Hmm.
The 5th page doesn't do that. Well,
Right.
you can say that the 5th page was not part of that original group of paper.
Right.
Wow. So some like okay, well, again, that was amazing. I'm very hyped. I know Nitty, wherever she's at, she's smiling right now. So could you give me like maybe a breakdown since you've done so many testimonies and helped out on so many cases, like on average, I guess, how many of your like cases are like maybe bank robbery notes for signatures and then like someone inserting a document into because that example you gave just now sound like someone might try to insert themselves into a will or something like that and try to insert a page or something like that.
I would say that the largest percentage of the cases that we examine, and this is just one private practice laboratory,
Hmm.
are cases involving handwriting, and of that group, the largest percentage is signatures. So we still look at, for the most part, signatures, but there are instances where, as an example, a person might question a signature. It's determined to be genuine, but in examining the document as a whole, we find evidence of alteration. So a person may have a particular suspicion in mind, and then we discover that no, the evidence that they had originally suspected, there's nothing to support that determination, but there's evidence indicating that a document that was signed was actually altered later on. So,
Mm.
the variety of casework, that we get mostly involves signatures and handwriting, but we do get a fair number of cases that involve other kinds of evidence, and evidence including things like altered or fabricated
Right. And
documents.
you should keep in
Right.
mind that there are certain types of cases that are only going to go to specific document labs, like the government labs, like the FBI
Yeah.
lab or the IRS lab. Will get very specific types of cases, and they're the only ones that are equipped to do those types of cases. So it's important to know that it varies not only across the board of what cases are, but whether those cases are going to go to a private lab or a public lab and what private or public lab they're going to.
The Secret Service does examinations to determine whether or not, for instance, cash money is the product of counterfeiting or is legitimate. And if there's a suspicion that money's been counterfeited, that's where it's going to go to be examined, because they're the ones that have the experience and the standards, the material standards, to make those determinations. And we don't really deal with those cases. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never dealt with a counterfeit note case, but still, as a part of my training and as a part of the work that I do, I need to be at least generally familiar with how those examinations are performed. So I have to have basic knowledge of the features of security of secure documents. And so, while I may never see that kind of case, I still have a basic understanding of how those cases are examined. And it's very straightforward. It's observation. And it is, detailed comparison with known legitimate standards.
Right. So another example of a case that we don't really get, but other labs might get, would be like a shredded document case, where they are actually taking pieces of shredded documents and physically matching them back up. That is also a type of case that document examiners handle. But us being an extremely small lab, it's just myself and John, a case like a shredded document case takes a lot of time and effort, and we don't exactly have the manpower to do that. But a bigger lab or a government lab have enough people to be able to handle those types of cases.
Right. That makes sense. One more nerdy question, because I'm geeking out right now. Since you guys probably look at so many signatures and types of handwriting, for the majority of your job, do you guys see any different, variety between maybe left-handed versus right-handed people? Is that such a thing, or am I being like foolish?
I mean, there's really no way that you can accurately determine the handedness of a writer. You can say, oh, well, gee, it's at a left-hand slant, so the writer must be left-handed, or, vice versa. But, there are plenty of right-handed writers that, slant their writing that way too. So handedness, no, you really can't make strong, reasonably well-based determinations as to which kind, which hand is the writer's
Right.
writing.
And I also want to take a second right now to point out that when it comes to being able to determine someone's honesty or their personality through their handwriting, that's not what we do. That's part of a field called graphology, and it's been around for a really long time, but not part of forensic document examination.
What do you mean honesty? Like actual, like telling the truth?
Yeah, so a lot of times companies will hire a graphologist to look at handwriting in somebody's application, and the graphologist, yes, like an employment application, and graphologists believe that by studying people's handwriting, you can tell whether they're being honest or dishonest.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, I mean, there's some graphologists who will look at the handwriting of a pregnant woman and claim to be able to make a determination as to the gender of that unborn infant, which is.
I'm sorry for laughing. Is that this is real?
It's something that people definitely do.
Wow.
Personally, I find it on the same level as like tarot cards or astrology.
Okay.
I feel like it's really
good,
accurate.
because I'm like, this sounds like a little like medium-ish. Like, okay, thank you.
I mean, right, look, I'll put it to you this way. For the county fair or a cocktail party or something like that, it can be a fun thing to do, just like having an astrologist come in and read your stars or whatever. But for purposes of serious forensic work, where people's liberty is at stake or where there's a significant amount of money at stake, it's not something that I would depend upon.
Okay, that makes sense. I would love to see that in an episode of like CSI Miami, though. That'd be crazy.
Honestly, when it comes to representing our field, that mix between graphology and document examination happens a lot, unfortunately.
I'm sure. That's funny. I'm sorry. I never heard anything. Yeah, because you said emotion, so I was maybe thinking as far as maybe you can is it possible to tell if someone's like standing down, Jesus, standing up, sitting down, or at like, doing something while they're writing as opposed to writing still and
You
steady?
you can make determinations
Hmm.
that writing is affected, okay? But it is rare that you can make a determination why that effect is occurring. So,
Right.
as an example, there are certain characteristics you might look for in writing of a person who was recently blinded, okay? Grotesque formations, extreme or non-existent ability to maintain baseline, that sort of thing. There are
Mm.
some characteristics that you could look for that are particular to people with Parkinson's disease, but I would never presume to make a diagnosis based on writing. I can
Right.
tell that writing is affected, but I can't really tell the reason for that effect. Only that it
Right.
is affected, and because it is affected, the importance of having contemporaneous material to perform comparisons with. And the fact that writing is affected can be an important component. Um, and perhaps even the knowledge of why that effect was. Oh, well, the reason why Uncle John had really bad handwriting at this point, as explained to me by a client, is because at that point in time he had a broken right hand, and that was his natural writing hand,
Mm.
and he had to switch to his non-writing hand to write his signature during this time period because his hand was broken. And that would be a reasonable explanation for the effect that I'm seeing in examples of his writing during that time period.
We also may notice like an unusual texture in the inks, and that could be an indicator that maybe they were writing on an unusual surface. So maybe they were writing on a desk that had a texture to it that affected how the ink went on the page.
Right.
Or maybe there was a contractor who was outside and writing notes with the paper directly sitting on top of a concrete block.
Right.
And so you had this
Mm.
pattern of what appears to be rather suspicious looking tremulous line quality, when in fact it was just, the surface on which the paper was resting.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, man. Well, I'm learning a lot today, but to be fair, I was fully ignorant going in, so this is
No,
great.
don't worry. This is my favorite subject to talk about. It's a lot to talk about, so please ask as much as you like. I love
I
making
got
sure
you.
that people know the type of work that we do and what we are and aren't capable of. And honestly, I just, it's my favorite thing in the world to talk about. This is the job I've wanted since I was 11 years old. So
It's one of the easiest of the forensic sciences for the average person to understand. And as I was saying before, when I go into court, if a toxicologist comes in and says that the white powder that they found in the bag in the suspect's possession was cocaine, the average person doesn't really understand what the basis and an appropriate understanding of the standards to make that determination. And they kind of have to depend on the credibility of the person who's giving that testimony. But with
Mm.
the document examiners, everybody's generally familiar with documents. So, our work kind of has to go that extra step to be sure that not only are conclusions reported, but the basis of the conclusions are sufficiently explained that the average person fully and completely understands it, to the extent that in some instances, people will in the back of their head say, well, I don't need this expert sitting on the witness stand. I can see this myself.
yeah, we like to tell people that we don't have expert eyes. We're seeing the exact same thing that they're seeing. We just know how to interpret what we're saying. And honestly, that can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because while the work that we do is super understandable to the average layperson, it also leads a lot of people to falsely believe that anybody can do this and you don't exactly
Right.
need any training to be able to do this accurately. And that's not true. There's plenty of studies to show that properly trained examiners
Do better than lay people.
Do much, much better than lay people. But like I said, it can be a double-edged sword, because while it's much easier for people to understand, it's super visual and they can see the things that we're talking about, it can also make them think that they know more about what
Get a little pretentious.
we do. But it's nice, because it's one of those things, like, I can show somebody a comparison chart between a question signature and a group of knowns, and I can say, do you see this particular feature here? And they'll be like, oh yeah. And I'll say, do you see that it doesn't occur anywhere down here? We consider that a difference. And you see people nodding their head, because they understand, they can fully grasp that difference or that similarity.
Because
it's me, I'm people.
Because they can see it.
Gotcha. That makes, I'm them. They are me. I got you. All right. So, I'm not mistaken, this did a question document examination take place or play a part in the El Chapo case?
It did.
Yes. One of the assertions being made by the defense was that Gustav Lara, who is known as El Chapo, was merely an underling in the overall cartel hierarchy, and that he took orders from people that were much bigger than him. And in order to counter that, the prosecution had a group of letters that he wrote when he was in prison in Mexico. And basically those letters, which were all in Spanish, gave instructions on what to do if the DEA came knocking at the door, or if this thing happened or that thing happened. And it kind of set a tone in terms of writing that this was a guy who was in charge. He was the main guy. And what they had to do is make a determination whether or not, in fact, he had written the letter. So I conducted examinations of several letters, and Gustav Lara had beautiful handwriting. He was a very accomplished penman. His writing was legible. It was aesthetically attractive. And it was also rather easy to identify. And I conducted examinations of the writing on those letters with a number of specimens that were produced by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and was able to offer testimony that he was the writer, to identify him as being the writer of the letters. And ended up giving testimony. He was tried in Brooklyn. And
I remember that, yeah.
Back a number of years ago, and as I'm sure you're aware, he was eventually convicted and now is serving time in the federal prison system. But it was kind of interesting in that case, because he had escaped several times from prisons in Mexico. There was a lot of security,
right.
And when I went in to give testimony, I mean, typically I've done work for the U.S. Attorney's Office for many, many years, and in fairly high profile cases. And the original Trade Center bombing, one of the defendants in that case, I gave testimony against mob figures, but I always walked in through the front door of the courthouse, went through security, and went up to the courtroom. In this particular instance, they ordered me to show up at the loading dock behind the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse, and I was escorted up by several armed agents, who then took me to a waiting room. And eventually, when I was called, which wasn't until a day later, I was brought in by another armed agent into a witness anteroom. And then before I walked into the courtroom, they cleared the hallway in front of the courthouse. And it was very, very strange. And, the security measures were very strong, but I really got a chuckle, because when I finished my testimony and I left, how do you think I got out of the courthouse?
Right through the front door?
Right through the front door, because I gave my testimony. They didn't care about me anymore.
That's terrible.
That's one of my favorite stories of his. But another thing that I want to point out regarding this case, like he said, the letters that he examined were all written in Spanish. John does not speak a lick of Spanish.
Well, I had high school Spanish, but I'm by no means literate.
But point being that a question that comes up is if we can look at handwriting or signatures in other languages. And we can look at extended handwriting, as long as it utilizes the Greek alphabet. So Latin alphabet. So the same alphabet that we use. And, you know, Spanish is pretty much the same alphabet with some tildes on top of some of the letters. But the interesting thing is we can look at signatures in any handwriting. So he recently had cases in Dubai and Hong Kong. And although we can't read the extended handwriting, we can make determinations as far as signatures, because signatures are their own unique thing. And you have to understand the language or the alphabet in order to make determinations as far as signatures are concerned.
Because it's just comparisons, right?
Right. You do have to have, if you're going to examine extended writing of produced by someone in a different language, a basic understanding of the writing systems that are taught in that particular country where they were educated. So, you know, having that information can be really important, because there are variations, even though you're using the Latin alphabet, there are variations in writing systems in South American countries as opposed to North American schools.
Right. But I think it's really cool that we're not limited by language when it comes to examining signatures. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize that we're capable of.
Right. That's, yeah, I never even thought about the language part. That's shame on me. That's good though. So with that El Chapo case, you said that he was writing letters and trying to assume, I guess, pose as if he was an underling as opposed to the boss?
No, just exactly the opposite. The letters were the things that established that he was the guy in charge.
Gotcha.
They were basically handwritten orders with respect to what to do in certain circumstances that set him apart as a leader, as opposed to just merely some cartel underling.
Right. And that's what the defense was trying to say, is that he was an underling, and these letters prove otherwise.
That's one of my most favorite episodes so far, guys.
I'm glad to hear that. He's got a lot of really interesting cases. My other favorite case that he was a part of was the murder of Irene Silverman. And what's interesting about that case, the official court case is the state of New York versus Sante and Kenneth Kimes. And what's interesting about that case is it was the first case in New York history where not one, but two people were convicted of first-degree murder with no forensic medical evidence, no murder weapon, and no body.
Irene Silverman's body was never found. Right. It's probably the same place Jimmy Hoffa's body is. But point being that you, as a former forensic student, know that you need usually all three of those things in order to convict somebody of murder. So not only is it interesting in the sense that these people were not only convicted of first-degree murder, but that conviction withheld through all of their appeals. Withstood appeal, right. Right. So that's the first time that happened in New York history. But the other interesting thing is the varied document evidence that was a part of that case. So as a little backstory, Sante and Kenneth Kimes were a mother and son grifter team. They were con artists. They made their living off of tricking people. And Kenneth Kimes was pretending to be a potential tenant in order to get access to Irene Silverman's property. Basically, she was a very wealthy woman living in New York. She was a socialite. And she basically had an apartment that on her property that she would rent out. And she had signed a lease, and they had basically used the signature from that and would either trace it or take physical copies of it and manipulate it onto other documents, because they were basically trying to steal all of Irene Silverman's property out from under her by using her signature. So there was a bunch of ESDA evidence from them tracing the signature multiple times. There were times where they physically cut and pasted Irene's signature, either by enlarging it or shrinking it to fit onto documents. And I think one of the most interesting pieces is that Sante and Kenneth Kimes had, 15 I think a total of 15,
Yeah.
but they were prolific journal writers.
Yes, and what they had in those journals was the details of all the different grifts and cons that they had done. And they were professional grifters. So in order to keep all of their cons and grifts clear and in order, they had to write that information down. So there was a ton of information that leaned towards what they had planned for Irene Silverman.
It was an interesting case and a kind of a test in terms of testimony, because the direct examination in that case was maybe a day, but I had 3 solid days of cross-examination, and it was interesting because the defense attorney became very frustrated with me because I maintained an even and calm demeanor throughout all of that, and he continually got aggravated, in part as a result of that, and that he wasn't getting the answers to the questions that he wanted, and became visibly agitated to the point that the jury noticed it.
Crazy. That's ridiculous. That's hilarious as well.
Right. And then, of course, another case that I feel like we have to mention is one of the cases that really brought a lot of recognition to document examination as a whole, rather than just handwriting analysis, was the Lindbergh kidnapping. So back in the 30s, Charles Lindbergh, who you may or may not know was the first man to circumnavigate the globe in a plane. Lucky Lindy, everybody called him. His infant son was kidnapped in the 1930s, and there was ransom notes there. It's really a sad case if you look into it, because likely what happened is, as the baby was being kidnapped off of the 2nd floor, fell and died immediately, because the baby's body was found, I think, within a mile of the home, just in a ditch. And the decomposition led people to believe that the baby had died pretty quickly after being kidnapped.
Right.
But they continue to pretend as if the baby was alive with these ransom notes. And what's interesting about that is my great-great-grandfather Albert S. Osborn and my great-grandfather Albert D. Osborn were 2 of the main document examiners who looked at the ransom notes that helped convict Bruno Hauptmann of the crime. And they weren't the only ones. There were other examiners, but they were 2 of the main ones. And this was just a hugely historical case for the time because of how famous Charles Lindbergh was. So
the amount of publicity in the case was beyond the pale.
Clearly, it's also amazing that you got a family of famous case solvers, like going El Chapo, Lindbergh, like, so you guys are going.
Yeah, typically Albert S. Osborn is the name that people learn when they're talking about document examination in college forensics classes. He is noted as being the quote unquote father of document examination in North America. So now we represent the 4th and 5th generation of Osborns doing this work.
Yeah, our practice is about 113 years old.
Okay. And you guys are keeping it alive, man. I like that. Well, here's another question. So two-parter before I start wrapping it up. How many, I guess, private and public document question labs are there? And I guess mainly for John, since you've been in the field since '82, how has question document examination changed?
In the United States, I'd estimate there's maybe 250 to 300
examiners, not labs.
Right.
Okay.
And they are spread among private practitioners like we are. So private practice allows us to, in criminal cases, work for the defense or prosecution, and in civil cases for plaintiffs or defendants. Sometimes we actually do work for courts directly to, for the courts.
Right.
Or for arbitrations. And as far as, the changes that have occurred, I mean, the process of examining handwriting hasn't changed that dramatically, other than that now we have, fairly good, solid written standards for the procedures that you undergo when you're making these examinations, but they're based on historical texts in the field. I'd say most of the technological advances have to do with things like visualizing and imaging. So, like the VSC that I showed you before is something that, was developed over the course of the last few decades and has helped a great deal. That was a technological advance. Indentations used to be examined merely by looking at them with oblique lighting techniques. So just basically strong light cast at an angle across the surface of a page, so it causes indentations to shadow up. And you can get a pretty good camera image of an indentation that way. But the problem is that lots of indentations are truly latent that, with the naked eye and without the assistance of newer technology, you can't visualize. So that was a big advancement. And then, of course, because the work is so visual, and there is the importance of being able to show those images, to show this evidence. So things like digital photography and the techniques that you can use with digital photography and software like Photoshop, as an example, are all important advantages that make our work a little bit easier or a little bit more efficient, or in some cases, dramatically more helpful. But, the process of examining writing and the way that we go about doing that is pretty much consistent with what it was years ago. What has changed is the quality of writing. So, I'm sure you've heard that, lots of elementary level education has eliminated the development and the teaching of cursive writing. And
I was literally going to ask you that. So perfect.
Right. And that's something that has affected writing quality. So while it used to be that, you could look at someone's signature and, for instance, read it, it was a legible body of writing. Nowadays, people are basically using much more stylized forms of signatures that not only are less consistent, but also are generally illegible. And that's unfortunate because a rapidly written, legible, consistent signature is a really, really good safety feature. It makes it very, very difficult for someone to attempt to simulate it. Well, if you, execute your signature with a couple of crossed lines, I mean, imagine how much more simple it would be to attempt to simulate that kind of writing as opposed to a really complex and well-written signature.
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent for bringing cursive back to students, not only so they can sign their name, but also cursive is a really great way for young people to develop fine motor control. So it not only helps them learn how to write cursive, but it helps them develop their hand printing a little bit better because they have better motor control.
I actually took cursive in like third grade, and like I just remember like people in the grades younger than me just weren't taking it, and I was mad like, well, I gotta do this and they don't gotta do it. But
it's created a really interesting dynamic in our field because there was a huge chunk of basically our generation and the next generation that didn't learn cursive at all. But now some schools, district by district, are bringing cursive back, or, parents are teaching their children cursive individually. So we have this huge group of people that never learned how to write cursive. So like John said, we're seeing a huge uptick in simplistic stylized signatures as opposed to more traditional signatures.
Do you know why cursive writing was developed?
I would assume maybe 4 signatures.
No. It was developed for speed, because the more times you have to lift the writing instrument, the longer it takes to write something.
And keep in mind, back in the day, when it came to like business documents, they couldn't just throw it on the copier to make more copies. What they would do is have people write those documents in triplicate.
Basically transcribing.
Right. They had to transcribe the document. So in order to be efficient, they had to be able to write as quickly as possible.
But also as legibly as possible.
Right. So in
Right.
order to do that, they wrote in cursive because you didn't have to lift your writing instrument off the paper, so you could write much more quickly. And another interesting little tidbit
Hmm.
about Albert S. Osborn, before he became a full-time document examiner, he was actually a penmanship teacher at the Rochester Business Institute. So that's a big reason why he knew so much about handwriting, is that was his profession as a professor.
Shout out to him, man. Shout out to the godfather of handwriting. All right, man. That's crazy. I did not know that. All right, man. That's you guys have blown my mind on it multiple occasions in this however long we've been talking, and
We're
I thank you
major
for that.
document geeks. It's a real problem. If
Well,
anybody
that's
mentions
good.
anything document related to us anywhere, both of us are immediately like, well, blah, 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 documents. This is what we do.
That's good. I like that. That's because I'm smiling because I'm shocked. Like speed. I thought it would have been for I don't know. My mom always says the same people who can't like write in cursive are the same people who can't read like analog clocks, which is true.
Yeah,
But
well, it's a generational thing.
for sure, for sure. But guys, I'm happy if you're happy. I've learned so much this episode, and I just got to thank you guys for stopping by. Kelsey, if you want to repeat that website you said earlier in
Yeah,
the
sure.
episode.
So Osborn and Son, OSBORNANDSON.com.
Gotcha.
That's just our business website. And then
Mm-hmm.
the two other websites that people should definitely check out, SwigDoc, S as in Sam, WGDOC.org. That
Mm-hmm.
is the website that has our current published standards and basically tells people our standards for how we do certain examinations or how we express things. And then the last website that I would suggest people check out is ASQDE.org. And that's the website for the American Society of Question Document Examiners, which is the oldest society of its kind and gives you more information about the history of document examination and experts that are currently active in the field.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, everybody, go check those websites out. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kelsey. This again has been my favorite episode, but I can't say that too loud. And I just gotta thank you guys for stopping by. I appreciate it. And gosh, shout out to document. Shout out to Albert S. Osborn. He's the real one here, man. Shout out to him, man. But thank you guys so much.
All right.
All right,
It
thank
was an
you.
enjoyable time.
So much.
All right.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye-bye.